When I was a young boy growing up in the 1970s in southeastern Wisconsin, about an hour out of Milwaukee, out in the countryside, in the area between two towns called Delafield and Wales, I was living in a regular family. We were sort of middle class, moving into not quite the upper middle class, but at least having some sort of contacts with that. I had a mother and father, a younger sister. Eventually, my grandfather came and moved in with us after his wife died in 1977. And in the 80s, things changed very dramatically because in 1982, my dad got sick and died. And there was a long process involved there that I'll talk about in a moment. But that's what this video is about, not just that process, but about what it was like before and after, what he was like, how reflecting on this has meant different things for me at different times. Viewers have wanted to see these videos that tell them a little bit more about who I am, and I think that my dad, despite the fact that he's been gone well over half of my life, made a very important set of impressions on me, and yeah, I guess that's the best way to put it. So I'm going to talk about a number of different things in this. The reason I'm talking about this now is my wife and I this last weekend were going through a lot of old photographs in order to put them away to save some space. And we spent some time, looking at hers and looking at mine, and they were mostly, childhood photographs with a bunch of college and things from our 20s, a few things from our 30s. Now everything is digital, so we don't, carry photographs around like we used to in the past. And it's remarkable how few photographs I have left, because I've moved so many times and gone through so many house cleanings, voluntary and involuntary, that I've lost a lot of the stuff that I originally had. And I kind of wish I held on to more, but that's perhaps a topic for a different video. So we were going through all of that stuff, and I realized that my dad's birthday had come and gone again, and I'd forgotten about it. I'm not good with remembering dates, people's birthdays, anniversaries, that sort of thing. And over time, you kind of, I think without having some sort of ritual, it's easy to lose track of these things. And particularly as more and more people who originally cared about these things exit one's life. My dad is he was one of the early people to die in my lifetime. My mom died over 10 years ago, and I've had a lot of surprising number of friends die, and sort of all of the upper level of my family, my grandparents' generation, with just very few exceptions who are not doing well, are all gone as well. And so one of the things that happens is if you want to know stories about people, you got to get those stories before all the people who know those stories themselves disappear, and then the links are broken and you don't have anything to go back to. And those people are also important for keeping that kind of cycle going. I used to light a candle for my dad every year on the anniversary of his death, which is in August. But I fell out of that habit a long time ago, and I probably should get started back on that, and also with my mom and with other people who I know. Anyway, when I was a kid, I grew up, like I said, in the countryside. Once we were established, my dad was actually a tax attorney, and he went to UW-Madison and went there for his undergraduate. That's where he actually met my mom, who was going to DePaul at the time. They were both first-generation college, and she was doing my mom's family is a French-Canadian family that's been in the States for a number of generations, but she grew up speaking French before English, so she went to DePaul, and she was going to become a French teacher. And then she met my dad, and their relationship was kind of, typical for the time. You've got this very pretty, vivacious girl who, kind of plays down her intelligence a bit, and she gets married to this very, bright, kind of sardonic, in some ways kind of a tough guy, but not a tough guy in the '80s sense. My dad wasn't built or anything like that, and they get together, and you look at them and you think, well, they're quite different from each other, but they're kind of well balanced. He was very planning and methodical, but could get very passionate about things as well. She was much more spontaneous, and yeah, it was interesting match. So they got married, and they weren't able to have kids, so they adopted me, which took quite a while apparently, and they adopted my sister from a different family. So I was adopted while my dad was still in law school, and he earned his law degree and a CPA, and then went to work. Moved out to the Milwaukee area, and they lived there in Thiensville for about a year, and I still have some very vague memories of that. And then we moved out to the place where we would live for quite a while. And when people ask, about that, I either say Delafield or Wales. We really lived on the border of both, and it was countryside. It was subdivisions, but it was like total countryside. We were like the second family to move into that, the Hills of Delafield it was called. And it was really quite idyllic in many respects. I think I'll talk about that more in another video. And my dad would, have to drive into Milwaukee every day and then drive back out through rush hour traffic. So he got home pretty late and left pretty early. During tax season, we often wouldn't see him for a couple months at a time, not because he wasn't home, but because he was coming home so late and leaving so early to go in. And he had to do frequent business trips. He worked for Touche Ross, which was a law firm downtown, which I think since has been absorbed by some other law firms, and they had some affiliates out in Kansas City, so he was out in Kansas City quite frequently. And actually, when he died, he was supposed to be opening up an office down in Houston, and so we actually had plans in 1981, 1982 to move down to Houston. That would have been a very big change for our life. And what ended up happening is he got very sick. He didn't work for Touche Ross the entire time. He worked for another firm after he left Touche Ross, someplace that was actually closer to home. And the reason he did that is he wanted to avoid that time that was taking him away from us, his family, his wife, and his kids. So he worked for a place as the chief accountant, and then found that they were cooking the books, and said, I can't sign off on this. So he quit and then went back to work for Touche Ross. And part of the requirement was that he would go and help open up this new branch down in Houston. So we actually had a lot of plans, and he was down in Houston for quite some time in the early months of 1982. And then he got sick. And this was really towards the end of the school year, so it was like May. He came up, and at first they thought it was just pneumonia. And at Waukesha Memorial Hospital, they were treating him, and the doctor couldn't figure out what was going wrong. He just kept getting worse and worse and worse. Then they thought it might be Legionnaire's disease, and they tried some treatments for that, but nothing was working. And the doctor seemed to have no conception of what was going on. It was already several weeks in now. So my mom decided to fly him to the Mayo Clinic, and she did that, and she went up to the Mayo Clinic, and that summer we spent a bit of time up there with my mom and dad. She was boarding with somebody in some house. She basically had a room. And so I remember my grandparents actually driving us from where we lived all the way across the state of Wisconsin to Rochester, Minnesota. And we stayed with her for probably a week, I'd say. and then we came back again towards the end. And they were never able to figure out what was wrong with him. They did some exploratory surgeries, and the wounds wouldn't heal. His body quit producing red blood cells, and they were giving him transfusions. They tried all sorts of things, and maybe now, with more modern medicine, they would have figured out what was wrong with him, but they didn't, and he ended up dying in early August. And I wasn't there when he died, but I saw him, I would say probably less than a week before he died, and he couldn't talk. He had a breathing tube in. He was very weak. He couldn't do much of anything. He could write a little bit, and we could hug, and he could communicate a bit with his eyes, and that was about it. And I remember, it was kind of silly at the time looking back at it, but I would talk with the physicians because I was a bright kid, and I would ask them, "Have you tried this? Have you tried this? Have you tried this?" And it was, it's to their credit that they didn't actually say, "Buzz off, kid. We're the experts. We know what we're doing." So that was a very, very tough summer, both before he died and after he died. My grandparents came and stayed with us at our house for a good portion of the summer, and that was good. I really liked Grandpa, Lumries and Grandma Lumries, and we played a lot of cards. I learned how to play cribbage and pinochle, and then another big part of the summer I spent out in Indiana, where they had all of their houses. My Grandpa and Grandma and his brothers, and my aunt and uncle, and that was good in many ways. I really enjoyed that place, and maybe I'll talk about that in another video. I don't want to go too much into detail. My sister stayed in Chicago with my aunt and uncle, and that was that. I remember learning that my dad had died. I was sitting in the back of a car, and I think my Aunt Bib either was driving or was in the passenger seat, and she'd found out, and she told me, and I knew already that he was dead. I'm not sure how, but then after that, it was, this is, in early August. After that, it was going back to Wisconsin, and the funeral, and the wake, and all sorts of people, and, family and friends, and it was a time of great confusion, you can imagine. I was 11 at the time. I turned 12 shortly after that. That was a birthday that really sucked. After that, nobody felt like having any sort of parties. But you also had this sense that you have to keep on, plowing through and doing things. So I remember one of the strangest things was, going back to school, and that was my 7th grade. And I was at a private middle school called University Lake School, and I'd been there for a year, and my parents had put me there because the public schools weren't very good in our district, and their gifted, talented programs basically just consisted of a woman who would drive around and visit the schools from time to time, and then giving us, things like electrical sets and tape recorders and saying, go off and do some projects. So we didn't really have much structure. And my mom and dad wanted me to be in a place that they thought would be more academically challenging. So that's where I was. And, everybody has to do this kind of, well, what was your summer like? What did you do? And this is a school where you were generally either very smart or very rich, and there wasn't a lot of overlap. I think, quite frankly, that kids like me were there so they could, bring the test scores up, because I actually was there on a scholarship. And so you had all these kids talking about these great vacations that they'd gone on and stuff like that. And what was I going to say? Well, my dad died, and that's what my summer basically consisted in, was waiting to find out what was going on with my dad, and hoping and having the hopes always sort of just disappear into smoke over and over and over again. And how do you communicate that? It's not just not wanting to be a downer to other people. It's more like there's nothing it's kind of funny when people die. There's this impression that we have that we got to say something to them to like console them, and you really can't unless things align just right. You can't do much of anything. But if you're the person who had somebody close to you die, sometimes you feel like you've got to be able to explain it or make it make sense for other people, and you don't even know what the hell happened yourself. So that was very tough. And the kids who I was close friends with already knew about it because they'd been to the funeral, but most of the kids didn't, and nobody really knew how to process it or deal with it, including myself. So I think at this point what I want to do is talk a little bit about what my dad was like and why that affected me, and why the kind of guy that he was mattered to me. So one of the things I can say about my dad is he was a really hard worker. Not only in terms of his job, I mean, he had to really bust his hump to get through UW-Madison and then get his CPA and get his law degree. He wasn't a great student. He applied himself. He was a smart guy, but he wasn't brilliant. And he would work very, very hard. And he not only did that in academics and in his career, but also in the yard. He, with the help of the neighbors, he built a deck. He did all the sort of work that was required to have a boat, to take us fishing. Things were done right when my dad was around for the most part. There were some things where he'd kind of slough off on, but usually it was because he didn't really know what he was doing. But most things, he'd research it, and then he would do it right. He was asked to coach a soccer team, so he went out and learned everything he could about soccer, and then did his best. The team unfortunately didn't do so hot. I think that was my sister's team, actually. Her version of the Wales Dragons. I was in the older class. And, he was a guy who really enjoyed having a good time and meeting people and talking with them. He was very outgoing. He could be kind of, cynical at times or sardonic. It was hard to get him to believe in things, but he also loved to joke around. And one of the things that I didn't like was he'd gotten this from his father, and it was kind of a typical thing for men at the time. He would tease us a lot, not in a mean-spirited way, but it would hurt our feelings because he didn't know how to show that he loved us and how to express affection quite as well. And that that was tough. But my mom would always explain to us, "Yeah, your dad he doesn't really get this. He doesn't know how to express, how to embody affection, except in these ways that are kind of safe for him." And given all that he had on his plate at the time, and given how young he was, I think that kind of makes sense, looking back on it. One of the things that he got into fairly early on was boating. And I think this came out of his deep interest in fishing, which he had gotten from his father. They'd go up on trips to Canada when he was a kid. Had he lived longer, he and I would have been going on trips to Canada. As it was, the furthest north we made it was Eagle River in Wisconsin, and that was a great fishing trip. He had clients every once in a while who'd take us out on boats on Lake Michigan too, which was kind of cool. But he saved a lot of money, and eventually we bought our first boat. We had 2 boats. Before that, actually, he would he would wake me up on Saturday mornings, and we would go out to Lake Nagawicca, and we would take the rods and the tackle boxes, and we'd rent a rowboat and row out into the lake and fish for a while. But eventually we bought a boat, the Green Arrow. It was a 18-foot tri-hull that was, of course, green, different shades. And we would spend, most of the time we would go to Lake Nagawicca, which was a decent-sized lake, and it had some great fishing areas. It had it had an island, which was kind of fun for us to explore, and we had some little bays that we could go in. There were some nice restaurants that every once in a while. Usually we'd pack food, but sometimes we'd go to a restaurant and tie the boat up at the wharf, which was kind of cool. And we'd do water skiing and tubing. He'd let me drive the boat around too. And there was actually talk at that time. And I was, this is when I was 10, 11. They were talking about getting me a sunfish sailboat to have on my own to learn how to sail. Because my family, I think, looking back on it, they were a family of people who were sort of slowly stepping up, improving the standard of living, moving from lower middle class to middle class, to doing the things that the upper middle class people would do. I think the sailboat idea was part of that, because there was that class distinction between motorboaters and sailboaters. We would go other places. We'd sometimes go to Pewaukee Lake with the boat. That was a much bigger lake. Sometimes we'd actually take it on to Lake Michigan. We did a lot of river trips with camping, where we would go in the Fox River with a bunch of other families, and we would camp out, and we'd move down the river slowly. And one year with 2 other families, and 3 boats total, we actually spent a week going down the Mississippi from Wisconsin. I think we went down quite a ways, camping out on sand dunes. So we did a lot of that sort of stuff. My dad really liked watching football, particularly college football. He wasn't into baseball as much as his dad was. His dad liked that, but he'd take me to baseball games, the Brewers. And I remember in Cub Scouts we actually went to a Admirals game. That was our local hockey team, AHL. He liked basketball a bit, but it was really football. And my dad had played football. He'd messed up his knee pretty badly in high school. And there's actually a whole story about that, so I'll tell you that story. My dad was drafted, and he was supposed to go to Vietnam. And he had this bad knee, bad enough that he had to actually walk with a cane. And back then, they were taking anybody. And if they drafted you, they were not going to hear medical excuse or stuff like that unless you were really, really badly off. His mom, who was, a pretty good person for negotiating things, for figuring out how to make things work, she went to all these people and she was like, look, the guy's got a cane. You're going to send him someplace where he's going to have to march 20 miles. You're giving him a death sentence. And nobody wanted to listen. So finally she went to her congressman. And when she went to her congressman, she didn't just send a letter or something like that. She buttonholed him and would not leave him alone until he said, yeah, okay, fine, I'll look into the case, lady. And sure enough, my dad didn't end up going, so he went to school instead. So yeah, that's he really enjoyed all these sorts of things. He liked getting together with the neighbors. As our subdivision filled up with families, and the prairies and woods got converted into landscaped yards and stuff like that. It really took a lot of time for that to happen. Not a lot of people had the money to do major landscaping. There's a lot of what we call sweat equity put into it. And I remember doing quite a bit of that myself. But it was a lot of fun. These are things. Everyone would get together, and some neighbors didn't get along with each other, but for the most part, most people did. And we would, have cookouts and parties, at Christmas time. Some of the neighbors got mad at my dad because we had a great fireplace in our old house. It was a fieldstone fireplace, and we would we'd have fires in there all the time and roast marshmallows and have hot chocolate, and then he would tell scary stories. And there was a certain level of scariness that we were used to that the other kids weren't used to. So my dad would tell these stories that would really, freak me the hell out. But it were okay. They didn't give me bad dreams. But the other kids would hear his stories, and they'd go home, and then they'd have nightmares, and then their parents would be mad. My dad was kind of an early adopter of quite a few things. He had a calculator when calculators were very new. And part of the reason why I had such an advantage when it came to education was not just because I was smart. It was because my mom and dad essentially homeschooled me way ahead of the curve before I got to elementary school. So, and even while I was in elementary school, my mom taught me to read, and I was reading by the time I was 3. And my dad taught me mathematics. And part of the way that he got me to do it was by letting me check answers on the calculator. Because that was so cool back then. Now we just take this for granted, but that was like so cool that, of course I was going to do all the math problems I could possibly do, so I could check them afterwards, and so that was good. He took a real interest in my education. He kind of tempered my mom's almost tiger mom, like all straight A's for you thing. I remember one time after I'd gotten a report card, had some A's and a few B's and like one C, and my mom, hit the roof. My dad came to me later. This is 5th grade or 6th grade, I don't remember which. Anyway, he had his high school report card. And I figured, my dad's a really smart guy. He's going to have great grades. And there were C's and D's and even one F. The F was in something that didn't kill him. And he said, see, grades until you get into college don't really matter that much. Don't worry about it. I'll talk with your mom and straighten this out. He had a good sense of perspective, I think you could say. So that's who this guy was. I think, and there's lots more that could be said about him the way there could be with anybody, but that's probably enough. So what happened with our life after he died? There were already a lot of changes that were in effect when we were getting ready to move to Houston, and then everything was off. But then when he died, things changed all across the board in a number of major ways. Of course, my mom was in mourning, and we were in mourning, and nobody really knew how to handle that sort of stuff. I think the hardest time for deaths is not right away. It's like 3 months, 6 months, 9 months later, because you're in mourning time. We're going to make allowances for you. That card has long since been played, and nobody really wants to know why you're feeling the way you are, what's going on with you. They've moved on themselves, even though you haven't. And so it was very tough for my mom. It meant some really radical changes in our life, and she struggled very hard to try to keep things together. We had my grandpa who was living with us, and she said, look, you're going to have to pay room and board if you're going to stay here. She was getting Social Security for us kids, but that really didn't give you that much. And she hadn't been in the workforce for quite a long time, except, retail stuff on Sundays. She would work at JCPenney on Sundays for, like 6 hours for a while. Actually, she didn't do that the whole time anyway. My dad made enough money at his job that she could afford to be a homemaker and, do the school things and cook these amazing meals. It's from my mom that I learned not only how to cook and how to cook efficiently and, what goes with what, but I acquired sort of a passion for food. I'll talk about that in another video sometime. But anyway, that sort of lifestyle was predicated on my dad being the big, wage earner. So you take that away, and he had life insurance, and the life insurance basically got used to pay down the mortgage because the house was mortgaged, and he'd only paid off. Geez, they bought the house in '75 and he died in '82, so they hadn't paid off that much on the house. We'd recently bought a new boat, a larger cabin cruiser, and within about 2 weeks, that got sold to one of our neighbors, who then used it for charter fishing on Lake Michigan. That was the first of their boats, and they kept, trading up. I still got to go to ULS, but there was, it was very clear that if I didn't get that scholarship each year, that was going to be it. And I remember having to compete for the 8th grade. I don't know what the deal was, but for ULS, there were a couple of us kids that were there on scholarship, and there was only one scholarship for 8th grade, so we had to compete against each other, and I edged out the other two guys, who then had to go to public school. So I lost some of my close friends, the only other kids that were really on the ball intellectually there at that level. Well, we did have one girl come in who was very smart, so that was kind of good. And there were some other guys who were smart in other ways. But my mom had to go back to work pretty soon, and she went to work at one of our neighbors' office supply stores in Waukesha. And, of course, we didn't move anywhere, right? We stayed where we were, and I now became very oriented towards Waukesha because my mom was working there, and eventually I would go to school there when I went to Catholic Memorial. So we have this whole house in mourning. Even the dog missed him, and his dad, missed him, and my sister missed him, and my mom missed him. For me, one of the tough things was being given this terrible advice by a whole bunch of relatives and friends. They're saying, "You're the man of the house now," and telling an 11 or 12-year-old that you're the man of the house when you don't have control over anything is a real recipe for disaster. I would get in fights with my mom. I'd second guess her about just about everything. I wanted to be involved in making decisions. And, not only were we both very headstrong, but she, reasonably enough, did not give me a big decision-making role. Because, 12 years old, that's not old enough to actually figure things out. She was having a hell of a time herself. It would have been better if we could have, coordinated, but, we just didn't know how to do that. And we came from a family and a kind of ethnic background where when people disagree, they yell at each other and they fight and they, passions come out. And, usually that'll blow over, but you mix in all this tragedy with it, and it made it very tough. In a lot of respects, you can look at other people's parents and lives and think about what they had, a father and a son, relationship, and see what you're missing, There were guys who wanted to kind of be my surrogate dad, and that never really worked that well. I think in part, again, because I was so headstrong myself. And some of them really meant well. I had a neighbor who did stuff with me, and we talked mainly about war games. He also got me into working out, lifting weights, which is good, for a whole set of other reasons. My mom had a couple boyfriends later on, some of whom I really liked. One of whom she was dating on again, off again for quite a while, and it was probably the closest thing to a dad that I had after my dad died. Little Polish guy named Francis. Tough guy, though. Really tough. Physically, mentally, a real stand-up guy. And, she was involved with other guys, too, some of whom I didn't like so much. It would have been really helpful for me to have a dad so I could have learned things that I needed to figure out on my own and did a bad job with in the process. Like, one of the things that you can learn from a male role model, if he's got his act together, is like how much to let other guys push you, when to take a joke and when to pop somebody in the mouth, where the line between that is, or all that sort of stuff. And lacking that, I became much tougher and much more aggressive than I should have been. I think I would have had a very different orientation towards academics if my dad had been around. Because my mom had such high standards, and because the academics seemed so meaningless to me, I just couldn't care. And I would, if I could do the minimum, and the minimum for me actually got me a good grade, then I would do it. And I would read what I wanted to read, on the side. And if it didn't work that way, I would just totally ignore it and say, I don't need this. I decided, by the time I was in about halfway through high school, I decided I was joining the Army. I didn't need any of this sort of stuff. I didn't take the PSAT that would have gotten me scholarships all over the place. If my dad had lived, I would have gone to UW-Madison, and he would have helped me negotiate the whole process. As it stood, I went in the Army and got out, then realized I should go to college, and my mom really wanted me to go to UW-Madison because, my dad was an alumni. And I looked at the application form, and it asked questions that you didn't have to answer at all, but questions that ticked me off. Like, when was the last year your parents voted? Just stupid things. I don't know what the deal was with the forms back then. And I ripped them up and threw them away. And things would have gone very, very different had my dad been alive. I think I would have rebelled against him in some things, and we would have had some fights. I remember even, before he died, and I was starting to I was probably about 10 years old, starting to get a bit big for my britches. I'd get in arguments with him. And I remember one time telling him, I'm going to punch you out. Imagine a 10-year-old kid saying that. And so my dad said, you really mean that? And I said, yeah, I'm gonna punch you right in the face. And he said, well, I'll let you try it, but you're not gonna like it. And he was sitting down in his he had this golden plush easy chair. And so he said, okay, go ahead. And I went at him and tried to swing, but of course, he just popped me one right in the guts. Not super hard, but enough to knock the wind out of me. And then I realized, I was going to be taking on my dad. But I think that sort of stuff, we would have had our clashes like kids do with their dads, but we would have worked that out. And so I missed out on a lot, and I had to figure out a lot of stuff on my own, in part because I didn't even know who to ask or who to go to. My uncles were good in some respects, but not particularly helpful in other respects. I like all three of my uncles now quite a bit, and have for a long time, but I don't think they were that helpful back then. And of course my friends were all just, a mess too, so they were going to help. Some of my friends' parents were kind of cool and could help me out a bit here and there, but it was hard for me to take advice. So, I think that ended up in a lot of ways kind of setting me back. It created challenges for me that I had to deal with that took some years away from me. So, another thing I want to talk about is there was this kind of experience as time went on of my dad slowly vanishing away. I remember I used to know what it was like, what his voice used to be like, and he'd recorded a few cassettes here and there, and I used to listen to them. And I remember when I was about 17, realizing that it just sounded like a stranger's voice to me now. I didn't recognize it anymore, which was kind of unfortunate. I don't have much stuff that my dad left behind because I've moved so many times, and then when my mom died, a lot of that stuff actually went with my sister and got lost here and there. A lot of the stuff that I took that had come from my dad or my mom or his parents got left behind when I divorced, and I took some of the stuff with me, and I wish I would have taken everything with me, because you never know what you're going to want to keep later on. I wish I would have kept every photograph that I've had my hands on, but I didn't. I let so many things slip through my fingers. I'm going to share with you two things that I do have. One is, I don't wear this very often, but this is my dad's college ring. It doesn't look like college rings do now, which is part of what I like about it. It's a law school ring from UW-Madison. I had it resized. My fingers are a little bit bigger than his, and it's nice. But I don't wear it that often. I probably should start wearing it more. And the other thing that I do use quite frequently, that was my dad's, is his old banjo. He didn't really do quite so much with it. He got it back, of course, folk music was the rage in the late 60s when he was in college. And the case actually has his college dorm room address on it. But this is a Vega. This is actually a long neck banjo. It's a very nice banjo. It's in decent shape. I play stuff that's not really typical banjo music on. I do play some of the old-timey stuff as well, but I play more rock stuff on it. And I go and find the chords, or I just sound them out, and then I play it. And when I first started puttering around with it, I think that there was sort of an attachment to my father that made me want to learn it, particularly because I was using these books that he had, Kingston Trio, songbooks, and things like that. But that's kind of disappeared, and now I just do what I do with it. And why do I play it? Because I'm kind of lazy, and I have the instrument there, and my fingers will do the fretting that needs to be done. So if I want to play and sing and hear myself, then that's what I do. Used to play bass guitar, but I don't do that anymore, and I suppose I could learn other. I've got a facility with learning instruments. I'm just kind of lazy when it comes to putting in the time. So, yeah, those are the things that I have. I guess the last thing that I'll talk about is it was kind of weird for me in my 30s. In part because my dad died so young. He was only 36 when he died. And now, he's been dead for 31 years, so he's almost been dead as long as he was alive in my life. I was 11 when he died, almost turning 12, and now I'm 44. So, you do the math, he's been gone a very long time. Still miss him quite a bit. Anyway, going back to my 30s, as I started approaching my 36th year, I had a harder and harder time sort of seeing past that horizon. It's not like I had a premonition something was going to happen to me or something like that. I just couldn't really think ahead about what was my life going to be like after 36, and in part it was because of my dad. His shortened horizon. I don't know what you would call this, and I'm sure that didn't have to be that way, but that's the way it was for me. And I would do a lot of comparison of my life in my 30s to my dad's life in his 30s. I had my kids later than he did, and my career took a long time to develop compared to his career. So I felt very much in my 30s as if I was kind of a failure in comparison to him. And I couldn't really think past that, I guess you could say. I mean, I'd done some things that he hadn't done. I'd earned my PhD, I'd written a dissertation, I'd handled the estate when my mom died. But, I look back at what he did and how he accomplished it, and I felt like he'd done more and lived more in 36 years than I had in my time. I guess I don't really feel that way anymore. But it's because I don't compare so much anymore. Time is kind of, and rough life has kind of beaten that out of me. And I guess the last thing I'll say, because I've been talking for a long time here, is I still miss my dad. And it's really weird to think about how am I missing him? Am I missing him as a 10-year-old boy misses his dad? Am I missing him as a 40-year-old man misses having a 65-year-old man to talk to? Am I missing him at my age 30 or 20? Or who's actually doing the missing? Who am I missing? Am I missing the dad of when I was really young? Am I missing the dad who was dying in the hospital bed with a tube shoved down his throat? It's very hard to say. I don't have a lot of images that come with it anymore. I just know that I wish he was around. I wish I could talk with him. And there's really nothing that substitutes for that. My hope is that someday I'll get to see him again and all the other people that I've lost. But you never know. And for right now, that doesn't console very much. So, any case, there you have it. Something a bit personal on my account. That if you're interested in this sort of thing, it lets you know a little bit about who I am, I suppose, but more about somebody who was very important in my life.